Anyways, talking about specificity, and specificity is one of the main pieces of CSS. So when you hear about CSS, if you don't understand inheritance and specificity or know what either of those two things are, then you're probably doing CSS wrong. Specificity is, again, at the core. So who here is familiar with specificity? Good. I expect lots of hands out of front end SIG about specificity. But really what it is, it can get really confusing when you get into topics about development and CSS and the styling and the interface side of it. So to kind of like dumb it down, I wanted to talk about a square. So how would you guys describe what's on the screen right now?
Boring.
Yeah, but this guy right here on the screen.
Square. Centered square. It's floating. Object with 4 sides.
So an object with 4 sides, there's a square, there's a white thing in the middle of the page, it's centered. I said the 4 sides. Wait, was there anything else that was really awesome that was said? Corey, what did you? 4 angles, yeah. So there's many different ways of identifying and talking about different objects. And when we're using CSS, you have to kind of think about the ways of describing your code as well as what it will look like. So if I put 2 of them together next to each other, how would you describe what's going on the screen now? And try to be as specific as possible.
Left and right, blue and white. Two objects. Different color.
So you can start having a debate and talk about, like, all right, there's 2 different things here, and there's no right or wrong way of describing these things. But if I wanted to give instructions, if you were completely blind, you weren't seeing this, and you were trying to tell someone what's on the screen right here, what would you tell them? And it may be things like there's 2 squares. If they don't understand what a square is, it's 4 lines that are connected that are solid color. One's white, one's blue, or maybe one's a light color, one's a dark color, and they're separated with some space in between. But you could get very specific. And identifying how would if I wanted to say, tell me some way to identify that I'm talking about the item on the right without using right as a keyword. Last. Second. We're not talking about code.
Yeah, no, I'm saying you're right.
Yeah. Oh, that would be confusing to the majority of everyone. But the point is just trying to get more specific about the ways that we think about things, and also identifying that there's a million ways to describe something that you're seeing. And that's one of the hardest concepts when it comes to specificity as well as CSS. So by definition, and this was just pulled from the web, but kind of condensed, browsers decide which CSS property values are most relevant to be applied. And what this means is they take the CSS code that you're writing. So specificity, again, is referring to CSS and the styling and selecting of different elements on your page. And then there's all these rules that come into play. And the concept of specificity is really easy to understand for a developer in our life, more specific in identifying different things around us, or where does that exist? How can I know what this is versus that? But the rules in CSS and using actual specificity can get really complex because it's a combination of properties. I mean, it's a combination of CSS selectors, and then rules like the actual cascading effects of CSS, and then the more specific about identifying them. And based off those more specific ways that you're identifying your selectors, the browser is going to inherit those and decide which CSS properties to win. So this isn't necessarily true. I'm just trying to dumb it down as much as possible, but it's identification of an item in your interface and how you're going to write some CSS code to identify that piece of code. So back to these squares. So again, we have A, B, C here. And looking at this pattern, and specificity is related to things that more than just writing CSS code and styling. It's identifying also patterns inside your interface. So if we looked at A, B, C here, what are some patterns that you see? Spacing, coloring, alternating. So if someone said, I want to create a pattern here, and this actually happens a lot in interfaces, you make kind of assumptions off of an initial thought, but then if we throw in another guy here, and now we have A, B, C, D, what patterns do you now see? So alternating colors. But then what if we throw in one more guy? And now we have this. And now the pattern's kind of broken. So when you're developing the code and building out these interfaces, you have to kind of make first assumptions, but then understand where the interface may be going in the future. Because the more specificity you have and the more that you're increasing your code to overwrite rules that you already had are going to be small performance hits. Like until recently, they used to be a lot more major, but it's just the way that you should start thinking and crafting your code. So identifying patterns and then coming to this and being like, all right, so is every other is white on the odds being white, and every other that's even is blue, and then maybe the last one is blue? Because what if there was another one? Would we see white before the blue? And then what if there was two more? There's just different ways of approaching this. Or we could say, instead of having a pattern, maybe it's just completely random. One box is maybe all B's are always blue, maybe all D's are blue, and F is blue because it aligns to something with the. So there's many different ways of looking at this, and I have a live demo, and I'm going to be bring this up is to really start thinking about patterns and select them, and being like, this F, how is that just the last child, or is it the nth child, the fifth nth child? That's another way of doing it. Or you could say, is it 1n, 2n, 3n, 4n, identify them and create a pattern that way. So there's many ways of doing this, but it's based off the interface and kind of the brand guidelines. So it's really hard not to bring up selectors, and this is more just like really short on selectors, but how it gets to decreasing specificity, which is something I haven't said yet. When you're building out an interface, especially for a large scaling project, having the least amount of specificity, but still getting done what you need to happen in the interface is the goal of it. CSS is not a language of overwriting or kind of blocking or trying to increase specificity, but that's a lot of ways that people handle and write their CSS. CSS is a language of extending and adding on. So by that I mean, a lot of times in an interface, and this is common with a lot of frameworks, you'll see like a link color and it's red. And instead of going into the code, maybe you don't have access, what you have to do to change it from red to maybe blue, green, or purple, you have to increase specificity to target that item on that page, which is, it's not wrong, but it can lead to a maintenance nightmare with your code and become very hard and almost unmanageable over time. So by decreasing specificity, it allows you to have a flexible, more reusable patterns inside your CSS.
I ask you a question on something you said. You say frequently, you say applications with high scalability, or
Yeah.
do you mean applications that have a large number of kind of target scales?
Yeah, no, it primarily, by that it means there's one application. When there's a company and they have application X, you know application X is going to start in like an MVP model and get larger and add more and more phases to it. But then that application is going to bleed over to other applications inside their whole system or organization. So you may have a portal that uses that interface, and you may have their public facing, you may have an internal application that's using it. So by large scaling, it's thinking of the whole system for that company, not just one individual application, but how the different products kind of communicate and talk to each other.
More than one application.
Yeah, and it comes up primarily with marketing sites too, because there's always the marketing site, but there's always the member site, and for it not to just be one piece, but how it can scale and reach other aspects of the organization and company. So with CSS selectors, just keep them short. So here's kind of an example of something to try to avoid. So we have something that is a direct descender of that, which is a direct descender of child, but it's somewhere within inside this. This can be confusing, and the more and more that your application grows, the harder this will be to maintain. Reduce the location dependency, so something like sidebar promotion, where maybe I want to have this promo in multiple places, but I created my stylings based off of it being inside of a sidebar. And I may want to move that promo inside of like a main content zone on my website, but now I have to have a parent that has a selector of sidebar, which doesn't make sense in the context I've developed it. When in reality, if I just designed it or crafted my code where promo was free floating, it would have been much more scalable. And lastly is make it portable, which just kind of echoes the last one, but this is avoiding type selectors and anything that's going to be tied to an element. So something like UL nav, because maybe the nav class could be applied to multiple objects. This has very high specificity, and this gets into some of the stuff that I'll be demoing here. So the goal is just to decrease specificity. Any questions on that stuff? Lab demo. All right, silence. Either I'm boring you or you're having too much fun.
So this is an anti-specificity promo.
What?
I'm guilty of the location-based class things. I found myself many times like building something and trying to reuse it, and it's like, why isn't this working? And then you're like,
Yeah.
too specific.
Well, that's like admitting you have a drug problem to your guidance counselor in high school. Screwing up your life.
Now I just use IDs for everything.
All right, cool. So I do have a demo that's going to go in those boxes, but I want to talk about some basic things in CSS. This is for those that aren't that familiar with HTML or CSS that are here. This may be a little bit confusing, but I'll try to keep it at a pace that makes sense. So I'm just going to create a container here, and I'm going to have an H1 inside of it, and then this paragraph. Oops. All right, so a pretty basic thing going on here. Now, one of the things also to avoid in CSS are using type selectors. So this is a type selector, any element. So a p tag's a type selector, a div's a type selector. You want to avoid those. The only time to really use them is when you're doing a normalize or a reset. And the idea is that those are far-reaching. So doing a type selector becomes very difficult. For example, let's add another div inside here. Oops. I say div border 10 solid. So now you see how this guy has this additional border inside here. So it's 10 inside there. If I made this more dramatic, like 50, you'd see it a lot more, right? That's because it's being applied to both of them. But maybe in reality, all I wanted it to be applied to was the last one. So then I have to create a rule, something like this, div, border, none. And now that border is gone. And these are common things, like showing this kind of out here makes it seem like this is very obvious, but this is a common thing that I see in almost every application that's HTML or CSS. And where specificity comes into play here is we have this div, and it's called container, right? And over here in Chrome Developer Tools, we have div with a border of solid, 50, right? So it's on the type selector of div. And then if I look inside here, even though I can't see it, if I go here and look at and select the other div inside that div, you can see I have this cross through and a border of none with this div overriding it. So this is an example of specificity because it has higher, it's being identified as if there's a div that has a descender inside of it that's a div, make it border none. So I've increased it, which allows me to override it. But this overall is a really bad example of having a selector. And I bring this up as a case of selectors as well as not using type selectors, poor use of overriding of CSS, and also incredibly bad use of specificity, but it gives me the results that I need. And whenever you start saying like, oh, this is a really bad selector, but it gives me the results that I need, is probably something that you shouldn't be doing, and there's probably other problems inside of it. But we know that that does happen a lot.
Just say no.
Yeah, just say no. So let's
Do you see many issues across browsers? You know, when you get into some nitty-gritty selectors and all, how they're applied?
do you mean the acceptance of them, or?
Browsers, just differences in behavior.
At times there can be, but for the most part, not really. And I just want to show you one more example here of specificity. So maybe this last guy, we want it to have a border now. So I'm going to have to say div, so let's say 10 solid red. So my goal was just to have it on the last guy, but now it shows up on both of them. And then we look at inspect this code here. And I have this div, and it's perfect. That's my red border that I wanted, but it's div. But you can see that I'm overriding something that has equal specificity or equal amount of selectors. The reason why this is red and this one's getting crossed out is because it's actually after the order in CSS. Now if I go to the other one, it's overriding the original rules. Again, that makes perfect sense because you just saw me do this really slowly. But in an application that has 30,000 lines of CSS code for no reason, that may be very difficult to understand. So then what people end up doing, and you see it all the time, is something like,
Don't do it.
last child. So now that guy just has it. But we look at this inspector, and we say last child, border red, but I've crossed out div, and it was originally a border of 50 pixels. This is getting into that world of really bad code, but I'm getting the results that I want. And I'm utilizing CSS 3 selectors, and the level 4 selectors are coming out, and they even have higher specificity than the previous versions of CSS. So this is just going to be something that gets worse and worse. So in reality, if we go back here, we could have just called this container, and then we should have had a selector here that was like, I don't know, demo, and then add this guy on here. So now this guy will have the border, and I'm not overriding anything. And it's just being applied to where I want to, and I have more control. And maybe our design changes, and we also want to add that to this guy. But I have complete control to it, which is really, really nice. So those are kind of like the selector pieces that we were talking about, like reducing the dependencies of it, reducing the specificity, of course, but also making it be more portable. So now let's look at some quick little demos here.
So can you go back to that
Yep.
portability piece there? Like a big thing that I've kind of found and kind of read about is like not really using tags or not having selectors and rules based on your DOM structure.
Wait, say that one more time.
So like what you had was like a lot of like div tags, for instance. So it was very dependent on your HTML document structure, whereas you eventually reduced it down to like class names.
Mm-hmm.
So in order to make something like reusable, if you do it once and you didn't depend on like the order of divs or just the tags that are being used, when you go to reuse those classes or those styles somewhere else, it generally breaks or doesn't work
Yeah.
because of that.
Yeah.
So like in like Bootstrap, for instance, that's like widely scaled out to many applications. I don't think there's many HTML tags in Bootstrap. There's mainly
Yeah. Bootstrap does have a lot of high specificity, and it does have a DOM structure that you have to use to get the results that you want. The bigger issue, and I'm going to touch on Bootstrap a bit, but after I get through some of these demos, people treat Bootstrap as just kind of a way to set that base, and then they override it, which again, CSS is not a language of overriding, it's a language of extending. So we'll talk about that. All right, so here we have this div, and I'm saying across the board, all divs have a color of red. So I put this inside here. I say, hello, hello, Vince. So now the hello, Vince, of course, is red. So the style cascades through it. It's inherited from div to this line here, but the paragraph tag also inherits it. And then someone says, we have a crazy rule of all paragraphs are color blue. So now this guy's blue because it's a div inside there, and this one's red, right? Later on, we realized that this DOM should have been a span, and now they're both blue, but we want that guy to be red. So there's a bazillion ways to say, hey, I want all, like, hello, Vince to be red. I want only one paragraph to be blue and one to be red. Without changing the DOM structure off of here, do you guys have any suggestions on how to override or use specificity to make this guy be blue? Yeah. Well, not classes, not changing the DOM structure. Yeah. So that's definitely one way of doing it, but yeah, no. So, all right, so it's almost kind of like a trick question too, because you could be like, well, what happens if we add additional divs? So if it was the first one's only blue, the first paragraph is only blue. All right, so we could do something like this. Come on. Oh, I need to put this in the wrapper. Whatever. Actually, because I said I couldn't change the code, I'm just going to do first of type. So that guy's blue. So the first paragraph's always blue. So the first div on the page that has a paragraph is blue. This is specificity. Now, one of the other things that always confuses people is if we went back and we look at this div demo and the paragraph being red, and that's happening here. And I just put lime after here. So now they both become red. I mean lime from red. If I change the order of this and put this beforehand, red wins. So one of the things with specificity to really understand is inheritance. So specificity is increasing the selectors to identify the element on your page, but then it also takes into account inheritance and the order of your CSS itself. So why this is red as opposed to lime, even though these are the same selectors, it's because of the order of it. So the order is going to override the actual stylings. Now, it doesn't matter how many I add afterwards. If I put lime in here again, that doesn't increase specificity because it's the same rule. So we're looking at the selectors here. Now, to make that happen and to select one over another, what I could do is add demo here, which is on this guy. So now that guy becomes green. The reason it's 1 is because of specificity. It's probably the most amount of times I said specificity in a short amount of time. Now, you can also see that div.demo comes before the red here. So in my CSS, so CSS reads from top to bottom. You're supposed to have far reaching at the top and get more specific as you go down. The reason why this wins is because of specificity. So this goes here. It still is green. The order doesn't really matter because of specificity. This is also really, really bad to do. But this is common because what we could also do is like, oh, well, we need to change demo to orange. I could add this. And now it's orange. And just so you know, you can actually double up selectors to add specificity, which is a really weird thing to do. So this guy is now orange, but it's above it. And again, this is one of those effects that happens inside large scaling projects and projects that have lived for a long amount of time. You start seeing code like this. Even if I drop the div here and I have two of these guys, it still wins. Now, one of the things that we could always do is add the important. And now it's red. So important's that sledgehammer. This should never, ever really be used. There's rare cases that make sense for it. Sometimes in animation, if you have like a zone that's a no speak, hidden, max height 0, and you want it to be completely gone from your page, but when you toggle a class, you want to remove it. Sometimes that happens, or if you're having to override inline styles that were generated from JavaScript, the only way of doing that is an important. That's just a weird one. Now there's other things inside here.
Or if you're doing SharePoint.
Yeah. All right, so let's look at some other things here. Some interesting things. Now let's get into a quick discussion about like the wars that happen between specificity. So both these divs, you can't really see them next to each other, but they have this guy has a class of demo and foo and an ID of demo 2. Foo, demo, foo, bar, pizza, demo 2. Oops, this should be demo 1. All right. So now if I say something like this, they're both color blue. They're both color blue. Now, if I said I want demo foo to be color red. Now they're both color red. Now let's go demo, start here. Demo 1, color purple. Purple. So even though this has more selectors, there's different CSS selectors that have higher specificity built into them. So you can see like an ID wins over this guy, even though this has 2 classes attached to it. And if I change the order of it, weirdness, it still wins. So whenever you're styling with an ID and a type selector, it is literally the most useless thing ever to do, but also styling off of IDs is kind of one in an interface and only. But you'll see this a lot, like a div in this. There's really no reason to do that. Now let's get crazy here and add demo 2 here. So everything stays the same, because this is incredibly specific. But what I don't need is all these selectors. But you see this all the time. And then people do something like this and get really specific and say this guy is going to win. Now for me to override this later on in my interface, because I want to change it from red to blue, it becomes very, very difficult to do that. So far, is this making sense? I'm trying to keep this low level.
So on that last one, just to clarify, that the first 2, the demo and the foo, those are like, they're not having any value on that, correct? Because the ID's there?
Yeah. Well, so
They also get included in.
they get, yeah, so that would be specificity to it. So if I wanted to override this, say this was like far up in my code, and I need to stress this one more time, like the order of your CSS, it should be far-reaching at the top, and the more specific you go is at the bottom. And because it allows you to kind of understand where the code is. Because later down the road, if I wanted to override that red, and let's think of a color, green. All right, so I put green here. Oh. It overrides it because it's in the order here, but say I just stuck it somewhere in my code. A lot of times people will do something like this, and even see like HTML inside here and body inside here. And then if I wanted to even get more specific in this guy, go back to red, I could add specificity by adding another type selector inside here. Oops. So there. Like, I didn't even, that gets to the point where it's so confusing on what you're even doing, what this means, when in reality, I should probably just add a class on this P, or just say, because there's foo here, and this one has bar, well, if I just want that one to be red, I could just say bar, color red, and I get the same results. And demo 1, we could keep it as demo 1 if that's the only one that has that. So there's a direct correlation to the code that you're crafting as well as the output styles, but then rules on how those can be living over life and time, which is a very hard concept to grasp. And this is like the core of CSS. These are very simple examples of CSS selectors and styling. And if you imagine building out an interface, they just get more and more complex. So is this new to anyone? It's kind of explained this way, or is it helping out? All right, so
That situation you're talking about where you walk into a client, an app, and you need to change
Yeah.
long-standing code. You don't know the ripple effects. Is there any
Yeah.
suggestions? I don't know if there's any tooling that helps.
yeah, so one of the things, if it's a legacy application and you're just building one piece and you want to build it right, you can namespace. So by namespace, I mean, say all this was the main application that existed out there, and I just wanted to focus on this section here, this right here, this where it's red. I could namespace everything that I'm writing as demo 2, and any of my selectors inside there start doing this. But imagine that this was more like far-reaching. You could put like an ID or some class on its most parent container and just apply all your stylings inside there, because it's going to be namespace. Those styles will not mix with the other styles, and they're going to win because of inheritance. I mean, because of specificity. So imagine that this whole section was like a deep interface. I could just namespace it and do that. And the goal would be that as you finish other pieces in the application, you could just remove that namespace, and then that becomes the main styling for the site. Namespacing, it does become helpful at times, but it does increase specificity, but it can help prevent those collisions. And tools like Sass make it really easy. So I could technically, so we had all this code right here. And let's just for the sake of playing with this. So you remember how this looked, right? Now the only difference was I moved this out as a parent container. Now if these were all the stylings that I had, but I'm seeing this kind of cascade through and I didn't want this purple to be my styling, what I could do is just put demo 2. And now I've increased specificity, and now it's only targeting inside of anything wrapped inside demo 2. And this goes back to the default. So if I were to add foo inside here, oops, that's foo. This guy will be purple, but it should be.
And you would namespace off an ID?
Yeah, let's go here. In the case of namespacing in this situation, an ID has such high specificity, I would do that. And as I was showing, like the demo one, no matter the demo one ID selector, it wins over even very specific things. And it also is one in an interface, but if that's in the case that it's just one piece, but if you're doing multiple pages, then use a class. But you could even do something like HTML to that if you needed increased specificity. But here, like, we don't have foo becoming purple here, but it's being purple here. Yeah.
So if you're using a class, you use a piece with multiple sections, you do styling.
Yep.
But then you, because of specificity, you lose, you would then use like HTML as a more
Yeah.
add specificity.
Yep. Yep. Exactly.
They would still lose out over ID section.
No. Well, yes and no in certain cases. But there's edge cases for it. But I mean, that's why inspector tools are great. That's probably like an hour-long discussion about talking about all the edge cases. But generally speaking, you shouldn't have that problem. And using something like SAS, you can see that this generated kind of a namespace in front of them. This is the common conflict that happens when you're using like Bootstrap, is you want to change a button styling. So instead of going into actually Bootstrap and rewriting 90% of it, people just plug it into their project, and Bootstrap has so many hard rewrites that when you want to change something, the only way to change it is to increase specificity, which, again, all these examples that I'm talking about specificity should either be edge cases or the code probably needs to be rewritten because it was written poorly from the beginning. The second you start getting anywhere in deep selectors, it becomes bad code. There's what's referred to as the inception rule, is you should never go 4 layers deep in a selector. But you should, in my opinion, you should really never go more than 2 layers, and it's more of like a namespacing treatment.
So Bootstrap, given that you don't recommend its use, it's still used pretty widespread in different projects all over the place. And so if you do come in and encounter something like Bootstrap, what is sort of a best practice for styling outside of the guidelines? So primarily you use skinners, there's a way to skin Bootstrap, right?
Yeah, best practice for Bootstrap is to not use Bootstrap.
Yes. Given
So,
that's an option.
yeah.
Then what would you do? You have to work with Bootstraps.
Yeah, depending on the interface, it's really going into the Bootstrap if it's not like being loaded from a CDN. Literally going into Bootstrap and removing comments, removing the pieces of the interface or the styling that you don't need, and making the rest of the site align with it. So as opposed to working against it, working with it, you can get creative. You can make your own themes inside Bootstrap and just utilize the DOM structures and the documentation that they have. But that takes a lot of effort and a lot of experience with both Bootstrap as well as CSS, HTML, DOM. And to do that, it's quicker to build out a custom interface.
So going off of this question,
Yeah.
I know SharePoint is probably the best piece of software you can use. So
I love SharePoint.
It's hard for me to really want to overwrite their styles, but what's the best way of not doing, the best way of doing that, having to use important and
Yeah.
all that kind of stuff?
In my use of SharePoint, that's where I started using that ID breakdown. SharePoint, I don't know if everyone here knows, but it has core 15 CSS, which is like the main master, worst thing ever in the history of development, that every selector is something like div dot, whatever the selector is, and then something else inside of it. And to override that, you have to match their selectors. So by matching their selectors, I mean the character, but then a lot of times that doesn't even work because depending on what version of SharePoint you're using, their CSS core 15 comes after your CSS file that you put in. So in the order of how CSS reads from top to bottom, even though you have equal specificity, the order of where it is in being rendered, theirs is going to win over yours. So then the only thing you can do is then increase specificity and add another selector on there. So using tools like SAS allow you to namespace everything really easily. Namespacing is the best, in my opinion, the best way of doing SharePoint, or unless you want to write JavaScript to remove core 15.
So the way our application though is kind of weird. So in SharePoint you have web parts,
Mm-hmm.
and each of my, or they wanted to use the layout that you can use in web parts or in SharePoint with the different web parts. So you have a header, and then you have left, right, and footer. So instead of putting everything into one content or one web part, they wanted to use this layout. So I have a separate application for the header, a separate one for the left, right,
Yeah.
and bottom one.
Yeah.
So I ended up having to reset like the different padding and margin and all that kind of stuff in between those two things. And they even had like the specific things for like H1s and all the H tags. And you had to kind of reset everything.
I've seen this too. It's I don't know if that was just a sharing of pain.
That was just sharing,
Yeah, but
sharing.
I came across this a little while back. It was a Core 15 reset. Someone wrote a reset for SharePoint that kind of stabilized it. But in reality, it made it worse because then you had to override what they had and override what you wanted it to look like and feel and what Microsoft had written. So, but if you want to just look up, there's some actual cool like tip. Why I would not suggest using that, but I would suggest trying to find that as a reference to how they overwrote some of the stuff, because you have to get creative. So I brought up this 30 selectors you must memorize, and dealing with these frameworks like SharePoint, it becomes really well, writing CSS in general, you should know all these. This isn't all the selectors. These are probably the most common ones. And when you're talking about CSS, even like at an entry level, these are the types of selectors that you should be familiar with and are almost using day to day. And without knowing these ones and dealing with specificity wars and trying to win the battle of this code versus my code, these things are incredibly helpful. And the goal for selectors is to try to keep them as short as possible and rely on really the best practices of writing HTML and CSS, because as I showed in the idea example, that had higher specificity than a class, but then there's other selectors that have higher specificity than classes. And if I went through every single one of them, your mind would be blown. But understanding where what these are can help you in that battle. Instead of adding another descender in there, maybe just switching what selector you're using. But again, it always depends on what the interface looks like. So here's this little fun thing that I made last night. And there's some weird stuff in here, but I did this pretty quickly. The idea here is to really show an example of breaking down your code and thinking about the pieces of the interface and how they can be scalable and reusable. I'm using piping inside of them, so if you don't know this, you can use characters to separate. You can just use whatever you want inside of, as long as it's not a quote, inside of an attribute. So class selector, classes, you can add random things like this to help you identify pieces of your code. So this pipe is to show that this is a styling of this unlist. So the unlist, so this is an unordered list with a list items inside of it. The unlist does a reset on the unordered list, which has a padding of 40 pixels, how the browser renders it. So this is a reset to set the padding left of 0, as well as the list style to none. And then it also has the LIs inside of them to be display inline block.
What's the point of the pipes in there?
So to identify where these things are and how they work together. So if I were to remove this guy, it wouldn't break my interface. It just wouldn't skip. Well, in this case, it would, because I'm using viewport width. to scale those guys. So that one actually should be inside here.
Should use emojis.
So that's a good example though. But why this is important is I'm breaking these into categories that are dependent on each other. So the combination of helper classes as well as component classes, object classes, and coupling them together. So if I want to get rid of something, I know it's not going to break. So in this example, space children, which is my favorite selector that I like to use, is the spacing in between. So if I remove that, now there's no spacing in between. But I didn't break my interface. So it allows me to identify and start looking at my pieces of my interface in a way. If I didn't want it to be, this is going to be in the demo here in a second, but that's going to be the styling of how to select the A versus B versus C and D. The other really cool thing about this is if I add in another element here, and I should have used the CSS counter for the number inside of it. I may do that this afternoon. But you can see that this scaled and grew as I added it, and it still kept an intrinsic ratio for the elements inside of it. So this interface is an example of how you can build something that can kind of grow over time and be customized to whatever your needs are. So it's growing there. And if I remove one, so if I remove A, it kind of grows up. So there's just C and D. So there's that aspect of it. But the piping is very helpful if you're using advanced object-oriented CSS and really scaling everything. So I know where pieces are aligned. If I get rid of this vertical line on this B, it's no longer vertical line. Shouldn't be. That's for something else. But this guy and this guy, using them. Anyways, going back to what we were talking about earlier, here are some resets I have. So I'm using type selectors to reset the H1s through H6s and the unordered. I like to actually write those specifically for the branding. I don't have that inside here because this was a quick little demo.
I don't think you can say the word specifically in this presentation.
Yeah. Yeah. So what I want to do is, so I'm using things like this color right here. That's how these are white. This is higher specificity, and it's saying box. And inside box, it has current color, which is CSS property that inherits the color of the parent container. So if I said body was red, those guys would be turned red. So that's how that works. And then that's why I have this span inside of it that has higher specificity to override the parent color. Because if I didn't have this, you wouldn't see the text. It would all be black. So that's how current color works. There's no such thing as, I can't use inherited because it will override, because there's CSS properties that actually have higher specificity, which is, there's a different name for it, but if you think of it the same way, that current color is going to win. It's just interesting. All right, so I have to add a selector for the span that lives inside here and make it white to override the current color because it would all be the same color. Now, what I've done here is I've added box set, and I'm going to put this after here. So another reason why I use the current color, yep.
So you think so it's okay to use tags if they are segments?
Yeah. In this case, the DOM structure was specifically made for, I said it again, was made for both the center aligning of the ABCD as well as the color. But in most of the things that I do, I don't like to do inheritance, especially on color. I like to use helper classes that are theme-based colors. But this would be, I mean, it's a decent solution if you know that's how it's going to work. And considering that this is more, like, probably what I should have done was use BEM and had C box and then C box _ title, and then have title be white. So here we have box set. Box set, if I outline it, is 1 pixel solid red. So you'll see it highlight around this guy. Right? There it is. Now, what I want to do is I can say nth child odd, and say color is red.
What's the ampersand?
What? Oh, this is for SAS. So what that compiles to is and nth child. And I actually forgot one thing inside here. So box set is kind of being tied to an LI right now. So what I could do is, this. So every nth child that's odd inside here is red. So this goes back to that example that we had earlier. And the cool thing about how this is, again, I keep talking about CSS as a language of extending. You can look through this and see that there's no scratch throughs except for on the user agent, which is cool. Inheritance in user agent is decent to do. It's almost impossible not to override those. But you can see everything's kind of trickling up here and extending. So right here, color red is being inherited. And then that's why I did use current color as my styling for this guy, CBox, because it's going to inherit those styles from that parent nth child. And this is a pretty specific example of box set, but it's a really kind of lower specificity, and it gives me such flexibility to build this out. So if I were going to try to build out what the demo I had earlier looked like, change this back to here. And then these ones were white. And then these guys were, I actually have the blue here. So now it has the every other. Now if we were to add in that E that we were talking about, there's a million ways for us to say, how do we make E blue? So remember it was white, blue, and then the last one. Earlier, someone suggested last child. And actually, we could just do this. Oh. So now we have that look and feel. So if I add another one inside here, it will be every other. So F is going to be blue, and we're overriding itself, which is interesting. But again, I don't know if that's the desired look and feel, but that's where you have to kind of work as a team and identify, is this the desired look and feel of this? Or was this the desired look and feel of this? Are the rules that I'm writing the right ways of doing it? And if I'm not, if it is supposed to be like this, do I really want to be adding extra specificity to override this? Because if I look at E here, what this is a current color being overwritten on this guy of white to that blue color. And that one, because of specificity as well as its order in the CSS. So any questions about that?
How come you're using color on the list item and not like background color?
Color, well, that's how current color works. Current color has been around for many years. So since IE 8, what it does is it takes the color that you have and inherits it the same way that color does, but you can apply it to any CSS property that uses color. So that's why I'm using current color as the background color, which it inherits its parent's theming color, and that's how it happens. Because if I wanted to do background color, I still could. I would have to do something like this. but then it got screwed up here. But you could do that, but you can see another layer of specificity that's been added inside here to target that individual one to have that nth other. And this is a pretty common structure of an unordered list item, a block inside of it. And to target that guy, I don't really need to target it. I can use CSS inheritance to get a lot of the styling that I want. So this is kind of an unnecessary use of specificity.
Color, I think of, so,
Yeah.
whereas background color is more of like the container.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. It's a characteristic of the current color value.
Yeah. So that's all I have. Any other questions?
I think it's worthwhile being at how specificity is calculated because it's kind of interesting. I found that kind of helpful as well.
Yeah.
Too.
Is this helpful? Did everyone learn something new? All right, cool. Let me know if you want to talk more about specificity.